Leia Carter was only 9 years old when she found them, that unconscious officer and his 2 bound German shepherds abandoned under the searing Texas sun. A simple act of a child's compassion would ignite a rescue mission, unraveling a sinister web of cruelty and corruption that plagued the town. Her trembling hands offered water, her brave spirit offered life, and her compassion would ultimately bring justice to a town shrouded in darkness. This is a story of faith, of redemption, and the miracle born when one small heart simply refused to surrender. Before we dive in, let us know where you're joining us from, and please remember to like, share this story, and subscribe for more true accounts of hope, courage, and the quiet grace that touches our lives each and every day. Heat radiated in shimmering waves off the asphalt, distorting the air into a hazy mirage. By midday, Dusty Creek, Texas, felt like the heart of a furnace. Cicadas shrieked from the brittle cottonwoods, and the scent of parched earth hung heavy in the air, so thick you could almost taste it. Out near the highway where tar bubbled on the cracked pavement, a small figure pressed onward barefoot, thin but fiercely determined. Leia bore the weight of that summer on her small shoulders with a faded backpack and a half-full water bottle she protected like gold. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with honey-brown hair matted into a knot against the sweat on her neck. A layer of dust had become a second skin on her knees and elbows, the telltale signs of a child who had no place to call home. Ahead, the town of Dusty Creek unfolded a sparse collection of low brick buildings beneath a web of sagging telephone lines. It wasn't a home, not really. Nothing had been since the fire 2 winters ago. She still remembered the acrid smell of smoke, the feeling of her father's embrace, and then only ashes. She had learned to exist in the shadows, to read the intent in a stranger's eyes, to always keep her head down. The folks in this town didn't welcome children like her, a reminder of things broken and lost. Still, Leia hoped she might find a bakery, perhaps a kind old woman who would spare a piece of bread or let her refill her water. Then, cutting through the drone of cicadas and humming power lines, a sound that was terribly out of place, a low, hoarse groan human. Leia froze in her tracks. It came again, followed by a softer sound, the heartbreaking whine of an animal. She turned her gaze, falling on a narrow service road behind a derelict feed store. This was a place people knew to avoid, overgrown with weeds and littered with old tires. The air tasted of rust and dust. Fear screamed at her to run, but the sound of suffering pulled her forward. One small step at a time, she crept down the cracked pavement toward the shape. It was a dark heap at the base of a leaning utility pole, and then her breath hitched in her throat. A man was bound to the pole, slumped forward, his arms cinched behind him with thick plastic cable ties. His dark navy uniform shirt, the kind worn by law enforcement, was ripped and smeared with blood and grime. One side of his face was badly swollen. A dark, dried trail of blood traced a path from his temple to his jaw. His badge somehow was still pinned askew on his chest. Officer Callan Hayes. He couldn't be older than his mid-20s. Dark hair was plastered to his forehead, soaked with sweat, and his lips were split and broken. Beneath the grime, his skin was a deathly pale. But he wasn't alone. 2 German shepherds lay at his feet. They were also bound. One was a veteran with a graying muzzle, the other lean and jet black. The older dog whimpered, its breathing dangerously shallow, its chest rising in a desperate struggle. The younger dog's leg was twisted at an awful angle, its fur matted with blood. Both wore vests stamped K9 Unit. Leia's blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to vanish, before she was mistaken for a part of this terrible scene. But the sound of the dogs, their soft, agonized cries, became an anchor that drew her closer. She twisted the cap off her water bottle. Though her hands were trembling, she knelt by the fallen man and brought the bottle to his lips. Hey, mister," she breathed. "Please, you can't die." Water slipped past his cracked lips. He began to stir his eyelids, fluttering, revealing hazy blue-gray eyes, swimming in pain. Where he rasped. Then his confused gaze found the girl. "Who?" "Are you? I'm Leia," she said gently. "You're hurt badly. You need this water." He blinked, trying to form words, but his head simply rolled back. His breathing grew shallow. Panic seized her, and she turned to the dogs. The older one weakly lifted its head, its eyes dim but kind. She poured precious drops of water into her palm and held it out. The dog lapped at her hand, its tongue rough and hot against her skin. The younger one nudged her arm, a silent plea to help its partner first. "You're such good boys," she murmured. "Just hold on for me, okay?" With the water gone, she looked to the searing sky. The sun blazed overhead like a white-hot coin, and the air shimmered in waves around the pole. Heat radiated from the man's uniform. His skin felt like it was burning with fever. If she didn't do something, they would all bake to death on the blistering asphalt. Leia frantically scanned the roadside. A small patch of mesquite bushes clung to life near a ditch. She ran to them, snapped off green branches, and dragged them back. One by one, she leaned them against the pole, creating a fragile shelter that cast a small patch of shade over the man and his dogs. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. She knelt beside him again, using her sleeve to gently brush the sweat from his brow. "You can't give up out here," she whispered desperately. "Someone has to be coming." As if in answer, the officer stirred. His fingers twitched. Then a faint crackle of static erupted from the microphone clipped to his shoulder. Leia jumped. "Unit 45, respond." The voice was a ghost, small and distant. She stared at the radio, paralyzed with uncertainty. "Hello?" she whispered. Only static answered. But the officer's hand moved with a last surge of will, his thumb weakly pressing the button. "Hayes," he managed to croak. "Down. South Road. Need help." His thumb slipped and the radio fell silent. Then he slumped forward, finally succumbing to unconsciousness. Leia's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't understand it all, but she knew he had called for help. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the desolate wind and the low buzz of flies circling in the heat. The younger dog let out a soft, mournful whine. Leia reached over her hand, finding its paw. "It's okay," she promised. "I'll wait with you." She didn't realize she was crying until a single tear landed on the dog's fur. Miles away in the Dusty Creek Police Department, a single red light pulsed on the main console. Sheriff Nora Beckett leaned over her desk, her expression tightening into a frown. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s with short-cropped blonde hair and lines of exhaustion carved deep around her mouth. Her crisp, spotless uniform bore the heavy weight of command. She had seen too much in her 10 years as sheriff, ever since losing her only son. Also a police officer during a drug raid that went horribly wrong. When the dispatcher muttered, "We've lost contact with Hayes again." That was the third time this month. Something cold tightened in her chest. Nora straightened. When was his last ping? An hour ago out near the South Service Road, the dispatcher said, tapping the screen. He was checking out reports of illegal dogfights. Nora's jaw tightened into a knot. "Get a rescue unit ready to move. If he's on that ridge, the heat will take him long before a bullet ever could." Snatching her hat, she moved with purpose toward the door, a sharp blade of sunlight cutting across the linoleum floor. For years she had built a fortress around her heart, telling herself each officer was master of their own fate. But Hayes was a painful echo of the son she'd lost. That same quiet duty, that same stubborn heart of kindness. Now that bond was a physical ache in her chest. Something was deeply wrong. "Dispatch. Keep that channel live," she commanded. "And tell EMS to get rolling now." Miles away on that deserted road, silence fell like a shroud. Only the drone of cicadas stitched together the empty spaces between heartbeats. Leia sat cross-legged beside the fallen man, fanning his face with a scrap of cardboard from the ditch. Every few moments she would lean in, waiting for the ghost of his breath. The old dog Ruger had slipped into a shallow, fitful sleep, his chest barely moving. But the younger one, Blitz, held his head high, his gaze fixed on the girl, a silent vow of trust, yet a refusal to abandon his post. "Don't you worry," she whispered. "I know what it feels like when nobody comes." Her words were a fragile breath nearly lost to the wind. She scanned the empty stretch of road shimmering under the brutal sun, praying to see a cloud of dust on the horizon. Nothing, so she waited. Her hands raw, her skin burning, her heart pounding a rhythm of defiant hope that if she just held on, someone would see the faint signal of this desperate miracle and come. And far, far away, a lone patrol car raced south, Sheriff Nora Beckett pressing the accelerator to the floor. The makeshift shelter of mesquite branches trembled in the hot wind, its leaves rustling like brittle paper. The heat bore down a heavy blanket that smothered all sound and all movement. She crouched beside the two loyal partners, wiping sweat from her brow with a trembling hand. Ruger, the older German shepherd, lay almost motionless, his breathing faint, his chest lifting in a ragged, uneven tempo. His fur was streaked with the ashen gray of age, and his eyes were clouded, but filled with a deep, weary patience. The younger one, Blitz, had fought to raise his head, his dark coat gleaming under the dust, his gaze burning with a duty that refused to be extinguished. "Hey," Leia breathed, her voice a thread in the fragile silence. You're the brains of this operation, aren't you?" Blitz's ears twitched. He let out a low, determined whine as he fought to stand. A back leg gave way, but he forced it to hold, rising on unsteady paws. Then, to her utter astonishment, he turned, nudged her arm with his wet nose, and began a painful limp toward the alley's end. Leia could only stare. What was he doing? Blitz glanced back, a single soft bark that was an undeniable command, and kept moving. It wasn't aimless. He was leading her to something. Leia's hesitation was only for a heartbeat, her eyes on the unconscious officer and Ruger in their sliver of shade. "I'll be right back," she promised to the silent air. Then she followed the limping canine down the narrow path, the very air shimmering around them in waves of heat. The scent of gasoline and hot rubber grew thick. They moved past overgrown lots and a fence surrendering to a wall of ivy, and then she saw it. A patrol car hidden in the deep shadows of an old oak, its windshield flashing like a mirror. The hood pulsed with a visible heat, and a side door hung slightly ajar. Blitz stopped beside it, panting raggedly. His wounded paw left a crimson trail, yet his tail gave a single determined wag, as if to say, "I found it." Leia moved cautiously, her breath catching as she peered into the vehicle's darkness. The air inside was thick with the scent of fear, sweat, and cold metal. Papers lay scattered across the seat, a chaotic collection of reports and maps. She saw grim words about dogs in danger, a darkness she couldn't fully grasp. But then a symbol of hope, a bright red cross on a white box pierced through the chaos. With trembling hands, she reached in, pulling the precious first aid kit closer. Her eyes then locked on a half-empty water bottle, a small miracle rolling near the gear shift. She grabbed it, a wave of relief washing over her. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're saving him." Blitz let out a soft breath, a sound of pure devotion. His duty done before his brave body finally gave out, collapsing onto the dusty earth. Leia immediately dropped to her knees beside him. She poured precious drops of water into her cupped hand, offering it to her hero. He drank with a desperate thirst, then rested his head against her knee in a gesture of profound thanks. In that single quiet moment, all her fear vanished. She was a lifeline in this wasteland. But then from the far-off horizon, a sound shattered the silence. The sharp cry of a distant horn echoed, a ghost of a sound devoured by the wind. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she scanned the empty road, but nothing came. There was only the shimmering dance of heat on the asphalt. Shaking off the false hope, she secured the kit and the bottle in her pack, her gaze falling on Blitz. "Come on," she urged, her voice a soft command. "We have to go back." He struggled, but with a surge of will rose to his feet, limping faithfully beside her as they returned. They found Callan just as they had left him, a silhouette of surrender against the pole. His lips were cracked and dry, his life hanging by a thread. His breath was shallow, yet it held. Ruger's tail beat a weak rhythm against the ground at the sight of his partner Blitz. "It's okay," Leia murmured softly, kneeling beside them once more. She soaked a scrap of cloth with the precious water, gently dabbing Callan's forehead, cleansing the crusted blood from his skin. She tended to the gash above his brow, her whispered apologies a constant refrain each time his body flinched in the depths of his unconsciousness. Inside the kit, she found gauze tape and a small bottle with the biting smell of antiseptic. She didn't know the right way, only that she had to try. A memory of her mother tending to scraped knees surfaced, a simple lesson for an impossible task. She worked with immense care, her small fingers trembling with the weight of it all. She bandaged his arm over the dark, hardened crust of old blood. Then her attention turned to Blitz, to the grievous wound torn deep into his leg, a brutal gash from metal or teeth. Without a second thought, she ripped the sleeve from her own shirt, fashioning a makeshift bandage to stem the relentless bleeding. The noble K9 watched her every move, his eyes soft, with an ancient understanding that she was giving him everything she had. "You're going to be okay now," she whispered, a promise and a prayer. "Help just has to find us." Miles away in town, the suffocating heat hung over everything like a death shroud. Sheriff Nora Beckett shoved open the door to the Red Cactus Diner, the scrape of her boots cutting through the quiet. The air was a heavy mix of fried food, stale coffee, and the grit of the road. She pulled off her hat, trying to wave away the oppressive heat as she strode to the counter where Tommy Ray stood, a permanent fixture in this place. He was in his 50s, a big, broad-shouldered man whose leathery skin told the story of a lifetime spent under the unforgiving sun. A grease-stained apron was his uniform, and his face was set in a scowl that finally eased when he saw it was her. "Afternoon, Nora," he grunted. "You look like you're chasing ghosts out in this heat." "Maybe I am, Tommy," she answered, her voice low and steady. "Seen a patrol car come through here. Officer Callan Hayes. He missed his check-in an hour ago." Tommy's brow furrowed in thought. "Yeah, saw one. Round 10 this morning. Headed down the South Road out past the old quarry. Hasn't come back." "The South Road?" Nora echoed, her voice sharpening. "You're sure about that? Sure as this sun is trying to cook us all alive?" She gave a single curt nod, settled her hat back on her head, and turned to go. Just as she reached the door, Tommy's voice called after her. "He's a good kid, Nora. You bring him home. Don't let Dusty Creek take another one of ours." She didn't look back. A shadow fell across her face, her jaw set as she turned back into the blinding sun. She strode toward the patrol car where Deputy Alan Moore stood waiting. Her partner for this shift was leaning against the driver's side door. Alan was in his early 30s, clean-cut with sandy hair and a face so earnest it still held the ghost of his academy photo. His uniform was dark, with the day's oppressive sweat, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "South Road?" Nora commanded, sliding into the passenger seat beside him. "That's our starting point. Dispatch logged his last transmission on frequency 143.27. After that, nothing. Radio silence." Her voice was steel. "Keep the scanner locked on that channel. We are not losing another officer." As the cruiser tore out of town, the asphalt horizon shimmered like a river of glass. Nora's gaze was fixed forward, her eyes narrowed to slits against the punishing glare. Because somewhere in that heat, one of her best was down, and a cold certainty in her gut told her this was no accident. Meanwhile, on a forgotten service road, Leia secured the final piece of makeshift bandage around Ken's wrist and surveyed her handiwork. It was clumsy, messy, but it was something. The officer's skin was cooler to the touch, now his breathing steadier. Blitz remained at his side, a loyal sentinel with his head resting gently on his handler's lap, while Ruger conserved his strength in a sliver of shade. Leia carefully poured the last precious drops of water into her hands, offering them to the older dog. He lapped at it gratefully, eyes half closed. For the first time in hours, she finally allowed herself to sit back to take a single shuddering breath. The piercing shriek of the cicadas had faded, replaced by the low hum of wind sweeping the plains. "Someone will come." She whispered the words, a prayer meant only for her own ears. They have to, but the vast landscape held its breath. No engines, no sirens, only the heavy sigh of the Texas summer. She drew her knees to her chest, her gaze shifting between the fallen officer and his faithful dogs. "You're not alone," she promised softly. "I'm staying right here until they find us." The promise felt heavier than the air itself. A part of her wondered if the words were meant to comfort him, or to convince herself. From beside the officer, Blitz let out a low, approving rumble, then finally closed his eyes. Above, a lone hawk carved lazy circles into the endless blue. Then, a sound barely a whisper on the wind, the unmistakable crackle of a police radio, searching for a voice. Miles away, Sheriff Nora's cruiser veered off the highway, dust kicking up as it raced south, chasing a fragile signal and a hope that refused to die. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry earth and the false promise of distant rain. Leia remained beside the unconscious officer, her knees drawn up tight against her chest, a small fortress against the overwhelming quiet. Her hand desperately gripping the tattered fabric of his uniform. The silence that pressed in on them was unnatural, vast and suffocating, broken only by the drone of power lines shimmering in the heat. And then she heard it a faint crackle. At first, she dismissed it as the wind hissing through dry grass, but the sound grew louder, a desperate stutter of static from the radio on the officer's shoulder. The sound jolted her. For a heartbeat, she froze, then reached out with a hand that trembled uncontrollably. "Hello?" Her voice was a dry, ragged whisper. Can anyone hear me? There's an officer. He's hurt badly." The radio answered with a burst of static. Then a voice cut through the noise, broken and faint, but undeniably human. "This is Sheriff Beckett. Repeat your last, Officer Hayes. Do you copy?" A sharp gasp escaped Leia's lips. She didn't know the name, but the voice carried an authority that cut through her fear. It sounded like someone who could make everything right again. Her hand shaking, she keyed the mic. "He's hurt," she cried. "The officer is hurt. Please help me. He won't wake up." The static tore her plea apart, devouring half the words. Yet miles across the desolate landscape, Sheriff Nora Beckett pressed her ear to the dashboard receiver. "Hold on, sweetheart, you hear me?" she commanded into the mic, her voice a lifeline of calm, masking the frantic beat of her own heart. "Don't move, we're on our way." But for Leia, only broken pieces cut through. "Stay, we're coming." Then, only the hiss of dead air returned. She bit down on her lip, a knot of pure fear tightening in her throat. "Please, hurry," she breathed into the silence, a prayer she knew they would never hear. A sudden fierce gust of wind tore at the makeshift shelter she had built, sending dry leaves scattering like fleeing birds. Small dust devils danced around them in the oppressive heat. Leia leaned over her small hand, searching for Callan's pulse, just like in the movies. His wrist felt warm, the beat beneath her fingers faint but steady. His skin was slick with sweat. She carefully unscrewed the cap of their last water bottle, dripping precious drops onto her sleeve, and gently wiped his brow. Without a second thought, she pulled off her own thin jacket, the only one she had, folding it into a small square to shield his face and neck from the relentless sun. Beside her, Blitz raised his head, his breathing labored and heavy. The young canine's ears swiveled, straining to catch a sound only he could hear. Ruger, the older, slower dog, simply pressed his body closer to his partner, using his own form to shield the officer's legs from the biting wind. Even on the edge of collapse, their duty was to protect him. "You're still trying to help," Leia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Good boys." The sky above them was a shimmering, bleached-out white, and a low groan of distant thunder rumbled. She lifted her head toward the horizon, squinting against the glare. A flicker of light caught her eye, a glint of metal flashing under the brutal sun. For a heart-stopping second, she dismissed it as a heat-shimmered mirage. But then it came again. A second flash. Headlights impossibly far away. Nora's knuckles were white on the door handle as Deputy Alan Moore pushed the patrol truck over the cracked asphalt. There was no siren. No sense in wasting the battery out here in the middle of nowhere. But the engine's determined hum was a thrumming heartbeat in the vast emptiness. She answered the call, Nora said, her gaze locked on the road ahead. A little girl. Couldn't be older than 10. Alan shot her a look, his brow creased with concern. A kid all the way out here, you think she's a witness? Or she saw it all happen? Nora's voice turned to steel. If Hayes is still breathing, that little girl is why. Alan gave a grim, determined nod. We'll get to them, Sheriff. A plume of dust trailed them as they veered off the main road, chasing the faint GPS signal toward the southern ridge. The landscape unfolded before them, a seemingly endless canvas of desolation, fields of sun-scorched grass and skeletal rusted fences offering no shelter from the searing wind. From the passenger seat, Nora tugged the brim of her hat lower. Her face, etched with the lines of long years on the job, was resolute but not without warmth. Beneath the star on her chest, she carried a private grief that never lessened. A single gold badge once her son's had remained tucked in her pocket since the day she laid him to rest. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static. Frequency 37. We've lost contact. Nora mashed the transmit button. Dispatch, this is Beckett. We have a broken signal from a miner. Keep trying to triangulate her position. I want ground units on standby in 10 minutes. Just as the truck crested a small hill, a flicker of sunlight snagged her attention, a distant faint flash of metal. Nora leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. There, she said, her voice sharp. Did you see it? Alan followed her line of sight. Just a reflection? Could be his radio or his badge. Or an answered prayer, Nora breathed. Punch it. Leia shielded her face with her arm as the wind whipped into a fury, driving sand and dust into her eyes. She scrambled closer to the fallen officer, pinning down the corners of the jacket that served as his only shade. Just hold on, she choked out, her voice raw. They're coming. Blitz's head shot up his ears, instantly alert. A deep growl rumbled in his chest, his eyes locked on a distant point down the empty road. What is it? Leia whispered, a tremor in her voice. Blitz didn't answer, but his body tensed with warning. A moment later, she heard it too. A distant hum of an engine drawing near, a spark of hope ignited in her heart, only to die as the sound deepened. Heavier, the rumble of an old pickup, not the piercing wail of a siren. A dust-caked truck crawled into sight, its windows blacked out. It slowed to a crawl, the engine rumbling. Leia's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. A door groaned open, and a man emerged. He was tall, with broad shoulders clad in a worn denim shirt and jeans stained dark with sweat. A rough beard covered his jaw, bisected by a jagged scar on his cheek. His eyes were small, cold, and filled with malice. Well, I'll be damned, he drawled, his voice a low, cold rasp. Looks like our little cleanup crew missed a spot. Leia froze in terror. He was no rescuer. Another man, younger and leaner, emerged from the truck's passenger side, wearing mirrored shades and chewing tobacco. He scuffed the dirt with his boot and spat. Told you this one had more fight than the others. That cop's got grit. The first man, Mike Devon, smirked. Not for much longer. He began to walk toward Callan, but Blitz, despite his own pain, lunged forward with a vicious snarl. Devon jumped back, cursing as he drew a pistol from his belt. Back off! Mutt! He barked. Leia's breath caught in her throat. She fell to her knees beside Blitz, her hand tight on his collar. Don't, she pleaded urgently. Don't move! Devon sneered, his eyes finally landing on her. Well, hell. Didn't figure on a kid. His partner let out a cruel laugh. You gonna put one in her, too? Nah, Devon said dismissively. She ain't worth the bullet. He leveled the gun at Callan's chest. But he's a problem. Before he could take aim, a new sound cut through the wind. A far-off horn, faint at first, but growing louder. Both men froze their eyes, sweeping the horizon. A flash of light appeared on the ridge sunlight, glinting off metal. Then came the faint growl of another engine, faster and louder than theirs. Sheriff! The younger one hissed. Devon cursed under his breath. We're out of time. They scrambled back to their truck, churning up clouds of dust. In seconds, the engine roared to life, and they sped away, disappearing into the haze just as Nora's patrol car crested the hill. Leia remained rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest. Blitz limped to her side, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. She threw her arms around his neck, shaking. A moment later, Nora's voice cut through the silence. Police, hold your position. The sheriff vaulted from her patrol car, with Deputy Allen right behind her. They ran forward, the air shimmering with heat. Nora's boots slid on the gravel as she knelt beside the fallen officer. It took only a single glance at the badge on his chest. A flicker of profound relief crossed her face. Then her training took over. He's alive, she snapped. Allen, get the medkit now. Leia staggered backward, her eyes wide with shock. Nora's gaze softened as she turned to her. Are you the one who called? Leia just nodded. You did good, sweetheart, Nora said, her voice low and warm. Real good. While Allen started treating Callan, Nora scanned the desolate road, her jaw set like stone. The tire tracks from Devon's truck were still stark in the dust. Her eyes narrowed with cold resolve. Whoever did this couldn't be far. But for this moment, there was a small victory. The faint, steady beep of a heart monitor starting up. The wind quieted, carrying the sound across the vast landscape like a whisper of hope. The harsh Texas sun seemed to soften as the ambulance doors finally closed. The air hung thick with dust, a ghostly trace of the rescue convoy that had just departed. Beside Sheriff Nora Beckett, Leia stood, her small frame shaking, her face a canvas of sweat and grime. Inside the ambulance, Officer Ken Hayes lay perfectly still, his skin ashen against the stark white sheet. A faint, steady beep from his pulse monitor was the only sound. Nearby, Ruger and Blitz rested in separate cages, IV lines tenderly secured to their legs. The paramedic, a burly man with salt and pepper hair and gentle eyes, carefully adjusted Ken's oxygen mask. Blood pressure stabilizing, he murmured toward Nora, who was framed in the doorway. Another 30 minutes, Sheriff, and you'd have been making a very different call. Nora gave a grim nod, her jaw clenched. We're not losing another one, she vowed under her breath. As they moved Ken's stretcher, his hand twitched, his fingers weakly curling, searching. Leia blinked, realizing with a start, it was her hand he was reaching for. Without a thought, she took it, her small hand enveloping his larger, calloused one. Don't leave them, he whispered, his voice a faint rasp behind the oxygen mask. Don't leave them. Then his body went limp again. The medic gently unclasped her fingers, offering a kind look. He's a fighter kid, he said softly. You did real good. But Leia remained silent. She simply watched the ambulance doors swing shut, a siren's cry tearing through the stillness. At Dusty Creek Regional Hospital, the sterile lights hummed overhead corridors filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic and brewing coffee. Callan was in recovery, unconscious but stable. A dark bruise crept along his jaw, his left arm bound tightly in gauze. Nora stood at the foot of his bed, hat in hand, her face a stoic, unreadable mask. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, revealing worry lines etched by years of service and sorrow. Her deputy, Allen, lingered close by, shuffling through a clipboard of paperwork. Word is he's gonna pull through, Allen offered quietly. Mild dehydration, a few fractures. Concussion? Nora exhaled, the sound heavy with relief. That girl saved him. Alan glanced down the hall where Laya perched on a plastic bench, her feet dangling above the floor. Tough one, that kid. Didn't cry until they offered her something to eat. She's alone as far as we can tell. No records, no family to call, not in any school. Seems she's been living rough for a while now. Nora's gaze softened. Then she stays with me for now. Alan faltered. Sheriff, are you sure your plate is already full? Nora silenced him with a single look, firm yet calm. A child saved one of my own today, Alan. There's no way she's spending tonight in a shelter. Alan nodded the debate over. I'll call social services, get a temporary custody order. After he left, Nora remained by Ken's bedside, the steady, rhythmic beat of the heart monitor filling the quiet room. Rest now, son, she whispered. You've done enough. Later that night, the hospital fell into a hush. The storm that had brewed all day finally broke, lashing sheets of rain against the large windows. Leia sat legs crossed in a small waiting room bordering the veterinary wing, where Ruger and Blitz were under constant care. She was dressed in clean clothes, a sweatshirt that dwarfed her frame and hospital socks that wouldn't stay on her heels. Her hair was still damp from a quick shower. A paper cup of hot cocoa sat untouched in her hands as she stared through the glass window, where she could see her two companions resting on clean blankets, Ruger's fur carefully trimmed around his wounds. Blitz wore a cast on his hind leg. IV lines fed into both their veins. The veterinary nurse, Marcy Dillon, entered with a quiet grace. She was in her late 30s, sturdy with auburn hair in a bun and freckles dusting her cheeks. Her voice held the steady calm of one who had watched 100 broken bodies mend. They're going to be okay, Marcy whispered, placing cool water near Laya. The old boy is a fighter, and the young one has enough heart for 3. Laya just nodded, her eyes fixed. Asterisk. They never left him, not even when they were hurt. It's what good dogs do, Marcy said. They stay, no matter the cost. Leia finally met her eyes. I stayed too. Marcy's expression softened. Yes, sweetheart, you did. When the nurse was gone, Leia pressed her palm to the glass. The air beyond smelled of antiseptic and warm fur. Ruger shifted his tail, giving a single soft thump on the blanket. Blitz's amber eyes fluttered open, finding hers. He strained to lift his head, checking she was there. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered, a solemn promise. In another wing, Nora sat as an island in the hospital cafeteria, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Rain bled down the window, smearing the parking lot lights into trembling gold. For years, she had walled her heart off from feeling. Too many funerals, too many folded flags. But tonight, watching that little girl cling to her wounded partner's hand, a fissure formed deep inside her. She drew a worn photograph from her wallet. A young man in uniform, grinning, his arm draped easily over her shoulder. Ethan Beckett, her son taken in action 5 years ago. The pain had dulled, but never truly vanished. And yet, when she looked into Laya's eyes, earlier those defiant eyes that had refused to surrender beneath the brutal sun, she felt a spark of something buried for years. A purpose. Maybe people are sent into our lives exactly when they're needed. She thought this might be a second chance to guard a life that still had a future. The morning arrived quiet and gray. The night's rain left a chill in the air. Leia was still by the glass when Nora walked in, holding 2 cartons of milk and a box of donuts. You with me, kiddo? Nora asked gently. Leia rubbed her eyes and nodded. Figured you earned something sweet after what you did for my people. The girl blinked at her slowly. I didn't do much. You did everything that mattered, Nora stated simply. She handed her a donut, then knelt to meet her gaze. How long were you all alone out there, Leia? Leia paused. Since the fire, she whispered. A long time ago. Nora didn't push it. She just reached out, tucking a strand of hair from her face. Well, you aren't alone anymore. Behind the glass, Blitz gave a soft bark, his tail thumping. Ruger yawned and stretched his stiff body. The sound cut the silence like sun through the clouds. A true smile touched Leia's lips. They like you? Nora chuckled, rising. Good. They'll need to like me if they're crashing with us for a while. Leia's eyes went wide. With us, until their partner wakes up, Nora said. Someone has to feed them, and I'm betting you're way better at it than I am. The girl stared at her hands, a tiny smile touching her lips. Okay, she breathed. As they walked from the ward together, Nora placed a warm hand on her shoulder, and outside the heavy clouds began to part, spilling a pale dawn across the rain-slicked pavement. And in the hallowed silence of the room, Officer Kalen Hayes stirred. His fingers twitched a single phantom gesture, as if reaching for a loyal partner. Rain had wept through the long night, washing the summer heat from Dusty Creek, leaving the air thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. The hospital corridors held the day's first fragile light. Monitors pulsed with a soft, steady rhythm. Nurses moved in hushed whispers, and from far down the hall a coffee machine sighed. Leia sat vigil in a chair by Kalen Hayes' window, her small hands clutching a book she had no heart to read. She knew Blitz and Ruger were resting safe in a kennel room down the hall. Still, her gaze kept returning to Kalen, to the fragile rise and fall of his chest, the stark white bandages wrapped around his ribs, the deep bruises now fading to a weary yellow. When his fingers moved again, she straightened in her chair. His eyelids fluttered, then drifted open, his gaze lost in the fog, suspended somewhere between the nightmare and the now. You're awake, she breathed, leaning toward him. You've been gone so long. He blinked and the confusion finally receded as he focused on her face. You, the girl from the road. Leia, she corrected gently. You're safe. Sheriff Beckett brought you here. Kalen's voice was a dry rasp, a sound broken by disuse. The dogs, he managed. They're alive, she said instantly, knowing his heart. They're okay. Ruger's exhausted. Blitz has a cast, but they're finally eating. A tremor of profound relief passed through him, and the tension in his shoulders finally let go. His eyes then found the doorway where Sheriff Nora Beckett stood with a clipboard, her uniform still damp from the morning mist. Morning, Hayes, she said, moving closer. You look like you've been through a war, but at least you're breathing. Kalen offered a weak ghost of a smile. You found us. Not me, she replied, her eyes shifting to Leia, who ducked her head. You owe this kid a debt you can't ever repay. I know. His voice cracked. Then his expression hardened, the raw memory flickering to life behind his weary eyes. Sheriff, he began, what happened out there? It wasn't random. Nora placed the clipboard on the nightstand. I'm listening. Kalen exhaled, each word costing him. It's Mike Devon. He's behind all of it. The illegal K-9 fighting circuit that's been plaguing the southern counties. Nora's brow furrowed with a dark recognition. Devon, the same man who ran our K-9 unit before I fired him for cause? The very same, Kalen said, his voice grim. He never left the life, Nora. He just built his own twisted version. He finds desperate handlers, buys or steals trained dogs, and throws them in a ring for blood money. I'd been on his trail for 3 months. He paused, his gaze distant. When I tailed the last shipment to a storage yard past the county line, they were waiting for me. Devon knew I was coming. Someone sold me out. They beat me, chained me to that pole, and left me and my partners to die in that heat. Leia's hand tightened on the blanket, her knuckles white. That's monstrous, she whispered. Kalen looked at her, his eyes softening with gratitude. It would have been our end if not for you. Nora's jaw was set like stone, a quiet fury simmering in her eyes. You have proof. I do, he confirmed, nodding toward the duffel bag by the bed. The body cam survived the worst of it, and the dash cam tagged the truck's plates before they took me. Nora crossed the room, grabbed the bag, and pulled out a small memory drive sealed in an evidence case. Her eyes grew sharp with purpose. That's everything I need. By that evening, the Dusty Creek Sheriff's Department was a storm of quiet, determined motion. The storm had broken, but a heavy electric silence lingered in its wake. Nora stood resolute in the operations room, its walls a mosaic of maps and photographs. Devon's mugshot glared back at her from the board, a study in cold contempt. A square jaw, eyes like stone. The face of a man who mistook cruelty for strength. Beside her, Deputy Alan Moore worked at a laptop processing the footage Ken had salvaged. A grainy dashcam video flickered to life on the screen. The images were fleeting trucks, rusted cages, the ghost of a desperate bark. Then, a flash of Devon's face near a warehouse gate. "That's all we need for the warrant," Alan murmured. "Judge Carroll already signed off on it." Nora nodded, her voice a low, steady current. "Then we move tonight." Alan paused, his concern evident. "You sure about bringing the dogs?" Her gaze shifted to the corner of the room where Ruger and Blitz rested on worn blankets. Ruger's muzzle now silvered with age, his eyes clouded but sharp with intelligence. Blitz stood at his side, the cast finally gone, his body coiled with restless energy. "They know his scent," Nora affirmed. "Hayes is certain Ruger can still identify Devon by scent alone, and if he does, that's the final nail in his coffin." A faint, determined smile touched Alan's lips. "Then let's go end this." The night air hung thick as their convoy crossed the Oklahoma border. The warehouse loomed at the edge of a dead industrial park, a monument of corrugated steel, bathed in the sickly glow of flickering floodlights, surrounded by a silence too profound for comfort. Nora emerged from her SUV, shotgun held ready. The leather of her vest creaked with each deliberate movement, her boots sinking into the soft mud. Her orders were sharp, precise. "Two teams silent approach. No shots unless absolutely necessary." Ruger stood beside her, his tail still, his head raised, tasting the air. Blitz, leashed to Alan, was a knot of tense muscle. Leia was far from this place. Nora had ensured she was safe at the station with Marcy, the vet nurse, who had promised stories and warm cocoa to keep her mind at ease. As the team moved in, a faint whimper drifted on the cold wind. Then another, higher pitched and utterly desperate. Nora's knuckles turned white on her shotgun. "Dogs," she whispered. "They're inside." On her signal, the team breached. The door screamed inward with a shriek of tortured metal. The scene that greeted them made even the most hardened deputies recoil. Rows upon rows of cages stacked like cold prison cells, each one holding a trembling, scarred soul. The air was thick with the stench of blood and terror, and in the center of it all stood Mike Devon, older than his mugshot, but with a cruelty that time had only sharpened. His beard was thicker now, his eyes chips of ice under the faltering light. A pistol dangled from his hand. "Well, well, Sheriff Beckett," he drawled, his voice a venomous calm. "Took you long enough." "Drop the weapon, Devon," Nora commanded. He just smirked. "You really don't get it. Do you, these animals? They're worth more than your yearly salary. You should have just let me finish what I started." But before a word could escape her lips, Ruger barked. Once. Twice. A third time. The sound cracked through the warehouse like thunder. Every single officer froze. Devon's smirk evaporated. "That's him," Nora said, her voice like ice. "He remembers you." Devon's jaw clenched. "That old mutt should have died out there." "Funny," Nora retorted. "He probably thought the exact same thing about you." The standoff shattered in a blur of pure instinct. Devon raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Blitz exploded forward, his teeth sinking deep into the man's arm. The gun clattered uselessly to the concrete floor. Alan moved in, tackling Devon to the ground, as Nora's commands cut through the chaos. "Clear the corners. Get those cages open now." And within moments the room filled not with fear, but with the sound of joyous barks and breaking chains. Deputies worked frantically, cutting locks, liberating the imprisoned dogs one by one. Ruger stood watch over the fallen Devon, his tail rigid, his chest heaving, as if avenging every scar he had ever carried. Hours later, under the pale, quiet light of dawn, the chaos had finally settled. Devon sat cuffed in the squad car, head bowed in defeat, a bloody bandage staining his arm. His 2 lieutenants were being hauled into another vehicle. Nora stood next to Alan, the scent of rain and rust hanging heavy in the air. "How many?" she whispered. 37 dogs. He said, "Alive." She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "That's 37 second chances." Ruger limped toward her, his nose damp, his eyes shining with both weariness and pride. Nora knelt, placing a gentle hand on his head. "Good work, old friend," she murmured. "You finally got him." Weeks later, back at the department, the news rippled through the halls. Mike Devon sentenced to 25 years, all assets seized, and banned for life from ever working with animals again. His men each got 15. At the courthouse, Nora faced a wall of cameras, but her words were few. "Justice can't erase the scars," she stated, "but it can stop new ones from being made." That night, alone in the quiet of her office, she shut the door and finally let the tears fall. It wasn't a cry of grief, but of overwhelming relief. Outside, thunder rumbled softly across the vast plains. In the kennel down the hall, Ruger gave a single, resolute bark, 3 times each, strong and clear, as if closing a long and difficult chapter. The sun had returned at last to Dusty Creek, not as the cruel, merciless blaze that once scorched its soil, but as a softer, golden, forgiving light. A month had now passed since that fateful night, and the town itself seemed to exhale, as though justice had brought a cooling balm to the sun-baked land. On the outskirts of town, past the red dirt roads and the ancient cottonwoods, stood Sheriff Nora Beckett's farmhouse, a humble home with a wraparound porch and a slanted roof that always seemed to smell of distant rain. The wind delivered the scent of cornbread and hay through its wide-open windows, and the sound of laughter often drifted out into the yard. Leia raced across the grass, her feet bare, her sun-kissed hair bouncing as she chased after Blitz, the young K-9, now strong and fully recovered. His sleek black coat gleamed in the sunlight as he weaved left and right, playfully teasing her with the tennis ball held in his mouth. And Ruger, the wise old dog, lounged on the porch nearby, his muzzle gray with age, his tail thumping a soft beat against the floorboards, keeping time with the wind. "Not that fast," Leia laughed, lunging for the ball. Blitz dodged with ease and barked once, and dropped the toy at her feet, then flopped onto his side with a theatrical sigh. From the porch, Kalen Hayes chuckled, leaning against a porch post, his arm still resting in a light sling. The scar on his shoulder was finally beginning to heal, though he could still feel it pull when the weather changed. He looked stronger, his once pale skin tanned by the sun. His uniform shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, and his eyes held a quiet, steady peace that he had earned. "You're getting slow, Blitz," Kalen teased. "Leia's going to take your spot on the force." The dog huffed as if offended. Nora appeared in the doorway, her hair loosely tied back, a dish towel over her shoulder. She was finally out of uniform, wearing simple jeans and an old flannel shirt. For the first time in what felt like years, the hard lines on her face had softened. "Lunch is on the table," she called. "And Kalen, stop acting like you're supervising when we both know you're avoiding dishes." He grinned, completely unashamed. "Those are your words, Sheriff, not mine." Inside, the house was filled with the quiet signs of a new beginning. On the mantel above the fireplace sat framed photos, one of Kalen with Blitz during his training days, Nora's old sheriff badge polished bright as new, and a framed picture that warmed her soul every time she passed it. Leia stood beaming between Ken and Nora Ruger's head, nudging its way into the bottom of the frame. The table was set with simple care. Cornbread was cooling next to a pot of stew. Lemonade sparkled with ice. Leia helped set out the plates, humming a tune she'd picked up from Marcy the vet tech, who always came by to check on Ruger's aching joints. Marcy had become a kind of aunt to her cheerful, dependable, and always smelling of lavender and antiseptic. Just that morning, she had brought over a handmade collar for Blitz, his name stitched perfectly in white thread. As Leia placed the napkins, Nora paused, just watching her. The sight was profoundly moving. A child who once had nothing now looked so completely at home. Leonora said suddenly, her voice gentle, "Can I ask you something?" And Leia looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "If you could pick any place in the entire world to stay forever," Nora asked, "where would that be?" Leia considered this for a long moment. She glanced out at the porch where Blitz was drinking water from his bowl, and Ruger dozed beside him. Callan was out back fixing the bird feeder, humming low and steady. The golden afternoon light streamed across the kitchen floor, bathing everything in a soft warmth. "Here," Leia said at last, her voice small but sure. "Right here, where they are. Where somebody calls me home when it gets dark." Nora felt her chest tighten. Reaching across the table, she brushed a crumb from Leia's cheek, her throat tight with emotion. "Well," she managed to say softly, "then we'll make sure that you never have to leave." As evening fell, the sky ignited with orange over the horizon. Callan was grilling supper in the backyard, as Leia shelled peas. Blitz sat faithfully beside her, snatching one whenever she glanced away. Ruger rested beneath the oak tree, his ears twitching at the cicada's song. When the food was finally ready, they all gathered at the table in the fading twilight. Marcy had joined them laughing while telling a story about an escaped donkey from a neighboring ranch. Even Nora cracked a true smile, the kind that came from deep in her heart, not just from habit. Halfway through their meal, Alan Moore dropped by, still in uniform dust coating his boots. He handed Nora a thick envelope. "It's official," he said. "The judge signed it first thing this morning." Nora flipped through the documents, her eyes going soft when she got to the last page. "Adoption decree, Leia Marie Carter Beckett. I guess that means we've got ourselves a new deputy around here," Callan teased. Leia blinked as understanding washed over her. "It's real." Nora nodded. "It's real." The girl froze, then burst from her seat, throwing her arms hard around Nora's waist. "Thank you," she whispered. Nora held the girl tightly, feeling that small heartbeat against her own chest. "You saved us first," she murmured. Later that night, after everyone left and the house grew quiet, the four of them sat out on the porch. The air smelled richly of cedar and cooling earth. Crickets were singing in the distance. Callan leaned back in his chair, Blitz's head resting peacefully on his knee. Ruger snored gently by Nora's rocking chair. Leia was on the porch steps, chin on her knees, just watching as the stars appeared one by one. "You ever think about leaving Dusty Creek?" she asked softly. Callan managed a faint smile. "I used to think there wasn't much left for me here." He looked around, the warm light from the window spilling across the porch, the dogs resting faithfully at their feet, Nora a tranquil shadow in the chair beside him. "I think this is where I was always meant to be." Nora's soft chuckle broke the quiet. "You're learning," Leia giggled. "That's because he finally listens." And so they remained for a long while, their words and gentle teasing weaving through moments of shared, comfortable silence. As the cricket song swelled and the wind softened to a sigh, Leia leaned into Nora's embrace and whispered, "Good night, Mom." That one word hung in the air, catching Nora off guard. She went still. Then a smile bloomed as tears welled in her eyes. "Good night, sweetheart." The next morning, sunlight streamed across the porch, painting the walls in strokes of warmth. Inside the family photograph they had taken sat framed upon the table. Nora, Callan, Leia Ruger, and Blitz, all of them together, bathed in that golden light. It was never the family anyone would have imagined, but it was a family forged in courage, rooted in kindness, and blooming with a love that grows quietly like wildflowers after a storm. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Dusty Creek, its light catching the farmhouse roof. Inside, the sound of laughter echoed once more, and somewhere woven between the bark of a loyal dog and the hum of a summer breeze, it was undeniably clear this simple, shining peace. This was home. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with a clash of thunder or a bolt of lightning. They arrive softly in the courage of a child, in the unwavering gaze of a loyal dog, in the hands that refuse to let go of another soul. In Dusty Creek, a scarred officer, a forgotten child, and 2 shattered dogs discovered something far greater than survival. They found grace, not the kind that shouts, but the quiet kind our Lord lays before us when we least expect it, a chance to heal, to love, to truly begin again. And maybe that is the truest miracle of all, that even in the barren deserts of our lives, God plants a seed that is meant to grow. And if we only dare to water it with kindness, it blossoms into home. If this story found a place in your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that goodness still shines in this world. Leave a comment below and let us know what you're thinking. And be sure to subscribe, because somewhere another story of unwavering faith and enduring hope is waiting to be told. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May His light forever shine upon your path, and may you never forget that the smallest act of compassion can be someone's answered prayer.